Bill, as you know, we're doing this archives project for the ISHLT, and we're interviewing leaders and pioneers like yourself in heart transplantation to really embellish the educational content of the society. Now, I understand that you did your undergraduate studies at Xavier University in Cincinnati, and you graduated in 1969, which ironically is exactly the same time I graduated. And you were a student when the first heart transplant was performed in that historic year of 1967. Tell us what you remember about that.
Well, I distinctly remember the occurrence of it because I was interested in going into medicine starting in high school, because I have an older brother who is 12 years older than I am, and he's a radiologist. So I wanted to follow in his footsteps. So I knew I was interested in medicine. I had no idea I was interested in surgery, but that was a huge deal in those days. I mean, the heart, heart in those days, I think Jim was sort of considered this mystical organ, and when that occurred, it made headlines. And I also remember the article in Life magazine, because every family got Life magazine in those days. And I distinctly remember that article, front page, where it showed all those transplant patients who died. So that was, those are little sort of snapshots of what I remember. It's not the reason I went into surgery, but I distinctly remember those things because they were huge events in those days.
And when did you decide to go into cardiothoracic surgery?
Well, it wasn't until I got to Stanford. So I went into surgery. I probably was considered the least likely medical student to go into surgery, actually. And everyone had pegged me for internal medicine. And the head of surgery, the chief of surgery at Kentucky, was a fellow by the name of Ward Griffin. And Ward Griffin was just this kind of really neat guy. And we're still friends today. He's still alive. He went on to become the executive director of the board of surgery. And it was his influence, and it was the idea that you could actually get almost instant gratification in surgery. So I originally thought I was going to be an OBGYN physician because of the surgical part of it, and delivering babies is really exciting, but decided there wasn't enough surgery to it. So I matched at Stanford in 1973. So I was an intern in 1973. And in those days, the way they worked it at Stanford was the interns started in mid-June, so that on July 1st, when the residents changed services, there would be a smooth transition, or at least a better transition, with the intern continuing on. So we were staggered. And the chief resident, my very first chief resident, I was put on Dr. Shumway's service as an intern, first month. And the last 2 weeks of June, my chief resident was Phil Caves. And he was just this really neat guy. And as you know, Dr. Shumway was this just charismatic person. So in those days, the intern was assigned to Dr. Shumway's service. So you scrubbed on every case of his. And he operated 5 days a week in those days. And he was just one of these guys, as you know, that just had this influence on people, and it was really exciting. I mean, Phil Caves and heart transplant. I didn't grasp the enormity of heart transplantation until I got there. And after a month on that service, I said, this is it. This is what I really want to do. So I got my courage up and went into his office, which was about slightly larger than a closet, and asked him in and said, I went through this whole thing nervous, boy, I'd really like to train in cardiac thoracic surgery, and he said his one single answer was, "Fine." And so that was it. I walked out of the door, and then you never knew when you would be pegged to come on to cardiac surgery, because you would be pulled out of general surgery. He did that. That was just the style.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Were there other people at Stanford that had a particular influence on you?
Well, Ed Stinson, when I got to know him, there were two people. One was a general surgeon by the name of Harry Oberhelman, and that has a different story to it, but he was a very good general surgeon, and he was the best out there. And he was, again, a very humble guy, just like Dr. Shumway. But Ed Stinson was, I think he was and still is probably the smartest individual that I've ever known. That he could talk about any topic in depth and in a very articulate way. So those two fellows probably had, along with Dr. Shumway, had the most influence on my life. Dr. Oberhelman, just as a sidebar, because of the crazy residency program we had, it was crazy, but it was way before its time, and we're probably going back to that kind of program now around the United States. So I was pulled after 2 years of general surgery, then did a junior year of cardiac, a year in the lab, and I also ran the heart transplant program, so at PGY4. And then at PGY5, I was chief resident on cardiac. And then, of course, it became obvious that we would not be able to obtain our boards if we didn't go back and do general surgery. So there was like a funnel effect of a bunch of people who had to go back and do general surgery. So I was doing general surgery my chief year on Dr. Oberhelman's service when we were making morning rounds, and he came out of the bathroom white as a ghost, sweating profusely. And I said to him, "Dr. O, you don't look well." And he said, his comment was, "I think it was the melon I ate this morning." I said, "No, I don't think it is." So we slapped him on a gurney, took him to the ED. CKG showed terrible ischemic changes. Filled him full of morphine, took him up to the CCU, and he cooled off for maybe, probably, I don't quite remember, but just a few hours, and then he started having pain again. So I called Dr. Shumway, Phil Oyer. We took him to the operating room, and I took a saphenous vein. Phil and Dr. Shumway did his operation, and that was 3 vein grafts, and that was 19, must have been around 1980, and he's still alive today.
Isn't that marvelous?
Yeah, he's still alive today.
Now, part of the time you were at Stanford, at least, was during that dark era of cardiac transplantation. What was the level of morale and the general feeling and attitudes there at that time?
You know, it was, we didn't appreciate that dark feeling. He never really let it affect him. He was always enthusiastic. In fact, I think I get my optimism from him. He was always enthusiastic. He would say, "Just keep operating." That was his, just keep operating. If there's a problem, just keep operating. And we had this cadre of residents who were at various levels in the program. So we had this enthusiastic group of residents, really led by him and by Ed Stinson. He really, and I can remember those guys talking about, saying, "We know it works. we know it works. We've shown it in the lab. We know it works. And interesting, during that time, then we started having a lot of visitors during those years. I remember Eric Rose came out, spent time with us. A number of people came out to look over our shoulder what we were doing. Of course, we were only doing about 15, maybe 20 hearts a year, so they would have to wait around for a month to be able to see a heart transplant. And but there were always heart transplants in the ICU and on the floor, because even in the best of circumstances, it was a 3-month length of stay for those patients.
And then in 1982, you were recruited to Hopkins. Tell us a little bit about the decision making, what prompted that that transition in your life, and that was a very exciting period of cardiac transplantation after the advent of cyclosporin. So tell us a little bit about that at Hopkins.
Yeah, sure, Jim. It was again sort of serendipity. Bruce Wright was my chief resident on cardiac, and our families, we became friends. Our families started to grow up together. And we had sort of talked, and when in 1981 I came on the staff as a junior faculty member. Bruce is, I think, 3 years ahead of me. So we had talked about doing something together. And after Bruce did the first successful heart-lung transplantation, he became a hot ticket item. I mean, he had calls from a variety of places. And I had originally thought that I was going to be at Stanford for a number of years. And I remember he came in my office one day and said, how would you like to go? We had actually looked at one other university together. And he said, how would you like to go to Hopkins? I thought, Lord, I'm not sure. I don't know, because, I had looked at Hopkins as an intern applicant. I was accepted for an interview, and I went up to Hopkins, and it was just one of those. So this is 1972, and my experience at Hopkins, despite its incredible tradition, was not a good one, because I asked him, I was married at the time, and I asked him where I was going to live at Hopkins. And they had a place called the Compound. I know you're familiar with this. And it was surrounded by a chain link fence with rolled barbed wire on the top. And I went home and said to Betsy, I said, Betsy, listen, I described this place to her, and there's no way I was going to take her to this place. And I said, don't worry, Betsy, that's one place I'll never take you. So when Bruce said, how would you like to go to Hopkins? I thought, golly, how am I ever going to tell Betsy that we may be going to Hopkins? So, of course, it had changed a bit since then. And so, but it was terrific. It gave, one, I was going with really my best friend, but two, it gave me the opportunity to start the heart transplant program, because Vince Scott had done the first heart transplant at Hopkins in 1968, and like most of those transplant patients, that fellow died after, I think, about 2 months, and then they didn't do any others. So when I got there, it was starting from scratch. They're really so. That was the opportunity. So we started the program. It took a year to plan it. We were fortunate that we had a kidney transplant program at Hopkins. And the kidney transplant program has kind of a neat little history, because it was started by Mel Williams. Mel Williams, a vascular surgeon who also did kidney transplants, trained with Dr. Hume. and was a very good friend of Dick Lauer's. So he sort of welcomed us with open arms and said, listen, this is terrific. We would love to have a heart transplantation program here to complement the kidney transplant program. I know all about it. I was there when Dick did his first operation. So we really had lots of doors open for us. And as you remember back then, there weren't really fledgling organ procurement groups. And the transportation was all corporate jets. We would go out and talk to companies and ask if they would donate their jet to go for donor runs. So we did a lot of that kind of logistical setup, and then did the first heart transplant in the summer of '83.
And during those years, you developed many research interests that have been very productive, but two of them were preservation techniques for transplantation, as well as non-invasive methods of looking at rejection. Tell us about how your interest developed and blossomed in those areas.
Well, the area of non-invasive, you know, that, as you remember, and we still, even today, don't really have a highly sensitive, highly specific way to diagnose rejection non-invasively. And so it was a real interest of mine. And we had gone from actually using the electrocardiogram during the pre-cyclosporin days, where Joan Miller and Patty Gamberg, our two coordinators at Stanford, they would go around every day, twice a day, and do electrocardiograms on these patients and sum up the precordial voltages. And then when you would make rounds at night, you would see that. And there was really a very close correlation to about a 20% fall off in the summation voltage and rejection in the pre-cyclosporin days. So actually, it was not a bad non-invasive tool, and we would biopsy that patient the following day. When cyclosporin came, we lost that ability, as you know. So the electrocardiogram was no longer a target to look at. So when I got to Hopkins, Hopkins is an interesting place. It's the culture of Hopkins is one of a research-driven institution. It really that was what Johns Hopkins wanted, and it has continued today. So collaboration at Hopkins is easy. I worked with a PhD in cardiology by the name of Jacobus, and we started the very early days of magnetic resonance imaging, and spectroscopy was emerging. We had one of the first machines, and we would, and actually the resident in the lab at that time was Chuck Frazier. And of course, Chuck has gone on to be the head of Texas Children's, and now he's the head of the whole Department of Surgery at Texas Children's. But so we did these kind of neat experiments where we did heterotopic puppy hearts and put them into the necks of adult dogs, and you could put the coil, the spectroscopy coil, right on the heart. So you got really nice peaks. And then, of course, you could just open up the skin and do a biopsy. So really, we had tight correlation. And in that model, you could predict rejection by 24 hours. It was really that sensitive.
And neurologic protection was another of your interests during cardiac surgery.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about that.
Again, stimulated by a resident. We had a resident, Mark Redmond, who now is in Ireland as their main pediatric heart surgeon. And Mark said, you know, we do pretty well with heart preservation these days. cardioplegia had come in, and we still use topical hypothermia in the OR. He said, but we don't do very well with brain protection. So he had a background in neurosciences, and he said, you know, the receptor in the brain that is specifically sensitive to injury is the NMDA receptor. I didn't know what an NMDA receptor was from a hole in the ground in those days. So we actually looked around. There was no PubMed in those days. This was mid-'80s, and we found a guy, literally, of course, right sort of around the corner, who was a world's authority on NMDA receptors. And so we forged a collaboration that actually has been now for 18 years of collaboration. And through his efforts, really, and allowing me to be the PI, we've had NIH funding for that whole time. So now we've gone from looking at trying to find the mechanism for neurologic injury in heart surgery, as well as pertains to transplantation. And we're at the genomic and proteomic level. We thought we had a drug that actually was one that could ameliorate the neurocognitive deficits, and that's really what we focused on primarily. And valproate is the drug, but it turns out that valproate in a human can create acidosis. It creates it at the mitochondrial level, interestingly. And although patients are on it fine, when you give it as a intravenous bolus prior to bypass surgery, and then with the pump, unfortunately it creates acidosis. So that drug is not going to be used. Like so much in research, you know, it looks good in animal studies. You know, that spectroscopy looked terrific, but by the time you put a coil on the chest, you don't get the same kind of reading. So although we tried it in humans, we translated it to humans, it wasn't successful. Where we had actually some of our biggest success was in preservation of the lung with deep hypothermia on cardiopulmonary bypass. And one would think that's counterintuitive to the lung, but we showed it in the lab, and we also did probably about 12 transplants that way, where we would put the donor on cardiopulmonary bypass, cool them down to about 14 degrees, and then shut the pump off, sanguinate the donor, and then go ahead and cardioplege the heart, plege the lungs, take them out, and then the abdominal surgeons would then scrub in, make the incision, totally bloodless field, and take the liver and the kidneys out. And we, again, Mel Williams was our partner on that, and we had really good preservation for the lungs and also for the abdominal organs. Mel, we followed those patients, but it fell out of favor because it's too cumbersome. And, you know, just it's too much going on. Although it still was a kind of a we really never had any issue with reperfusion injury in those lungs during that time. So, but too complicated.
So let's talk a little bit about the ISHLT. So you were the 12th president in 1996 and 97. Those were very interesting years, both in the field and the society.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the issues you faced and the challenges of that time.
It was a time of really, again, enthusiasm, because this was 1996, 97. I was the president in 97, following Sharon Hunt, and I was Sharon's program committee chair, and people were very enthusiastic about it. The one issue that we faced was that at the meeting, I believe it was the meeting in New York with associated with the annual meeting, the board meeting. We as the board decided to take back the invitation from Japan for the Osaka meeting, and it was a lot of discussion. It was a split vote, but we decided to rescind that invitation. So then I became the president, and they were the Japanese contingent were rightfully upset with us, and
the reasons were financial?
The reasons were predominantly financial. There wasn't really a very good plan presented to the board. There was worry that the attendance would be low. And, but you know, Jim, it really bothered me because we had made a commitment. We had made a commitment to them, and it really bugged me. So I had conversations with Dr. Kawashima, and I invited him to come back to the interim board meeting, which was in Baltimore, and he presented then a package. The finances of it seemed reasonable. He was going to provide financial support for some younger faculty and residents to come to Osaka, and and of course it meant a lot to them because they were trying to develop enthusiasm in their country for transplantation. So although the vote wasn't unanimous, we voted to go to Osaka after a lot of discussion. And as it turns out, I think it was a very successful meeting. And
as you look over the following decade, after that, really 13, 14 years, do you think ISHLT is where it should be? Has it met your expectations? What do you see as its future?
Oh, I think it's a vibrant society. It's been in the first several, say the first 10 to 15 years of it. It's, you know, the society, even though it grew, you grew with it, and you knew just about almost everyone in it. Not quite, but I mean it was really. So the gatherings, the annual meetings were more than just scientific presentations. It was, you know, a lot of seeing your old friends and talking about what sometimes the hallway discussions are as more informative than the presentation. So I think it has grown appropriately. It includes everyone involved in transplantation, which I think is very important. It brings the nurses in, the coordinators, the transplant physicians, and I think the management. What really helped this organization become an effective educational and spokes organization for transplantation was the administrative organization, I believe. I mean, it's the leadership it's presidential leadership, it's the board, no question about it. But before Amanda came on board and her team, the board was a managing board, pretty much. We managed everything. Whereas now it's a governing board, which is a way I think it should be. And you don't worry about the managing part of it. And I mean, this meeting is a great example of how that administrative team and the organization, you and your board, responded to a real issue and responded in 24 hours and made the various internet connections to our European colleagues work almost flawlessly that I've seen. So I think it's, can it do more? Oh, sure. As you pointed out, yesterday, we will see these young people coming into the field are going to see developments in treatment for heart failure, the non-surgical treatment, but they're also going to see, third generation ventricular assist devices. They're going to see better and immunosuppressive drugs. Maybe they'll see xenotransplantation, but I'm sort of in Dr. Shumway's view when he would say xenotransplantation is the future of transplantation, and it always will be. But you never say never. But these kids coming into the field now are in for another great ride.
One final question. A major portion of your life has been dedicated to education. Yes. Of surgeons and surgical philosophies. Comment to us a little bit about what you see as the future opportunities in cardiac surgery in general.
Well, as you know, I am an optimist. I just don't believe the naysayers about cardiac surgery, and I don't believe it because of a gut thing. I just believe it in looking at what is going on today and what will go on in the next 2 decades. We have an aging population, one that the United States has never seen before in total numbers. We have the prevalence of cardiac disease increasing, although the mortality for cardiac disease is going down, but that means there's even more people living with this problem. So I see this as an opportunity. What I'm concerned about is that we won't have the manpower to take care of the patients as they age and develop cardiac problems. But it's still a very exciting field in my mind. My gosh, what we've seen over time, and what the idea of minimally invasive type of procedures, the percutaneous valves. We're going to be involved in the percutaneous valves. It is going to be a collaboration approach, and perhaps one day, if people can put their politics aside, we would have a sort of cardiovascular physician that would manage patients and be able to operate on them. I see there's such a opportunity to merge the various specialties if people would just open their minds to it and not defend their turf. It just I see it as and not only would it benefit our patients, but it would benefit and provide opportunities for our residents and attract more into the field. That's, to me, the most important thing that we can do is provide the leadership for the next generation, and that's always been fun. I've enjoyed that tremendously, and to see a young, well, maybe they're not so young now that have trained in our program, up on the podium presenting and being looked at as leaders. To me, that is makes me feel very good, and and I think, Jim, we can continue to do this. I don't see any obstacle that is not surmountable. And some of the brightest, and I know everybody says this about their field, and it's probably true, but we have some of the brightest people in cardiac surgery and coming in, not just people we know, coming into the field. And I see them, and they're going to be the ones to continue this incredible tradition that's been established.
Great. Thanks very much.
Hey, Jim, thanks. It's been fun. Enjoy it.